Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast, where we ignite the sparks of change and inspire a world free of racism. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting the most cutting-edge anti-racist research in education for the purpose of connecting practitioners to powerful research-based approaches to racial equity. I am your host, Dr. Tracy A. Benson, and today we invite you on a transformative journey as we delve into the efforts and triumphs of those dedicated to fostering racial equity within education. Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute Research to Practice podcast. Today, we have the opportunity to talk with Dr. Richard Ingersoll about his decades of research on the teaching profession. Dr. Ingersoll is a professor of education and sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on the character of elementary and secondary schools as workplaces, teachers as employees, and teaching as a profession. And also, I've been following Dr. Ingersoll's research for decades, ever since I was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1996. And so this is sort of a dream come true to speak to the professor who I've been following for like decades. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Tracy. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. So I know that you have some background at practice, right? You used to be a classroom teacher. Can you tell us a little bit about that transition from the classroom into academia, and why did you choose to study teaching? Like, how do you even get interested in that as a topic?
It is part of my story. All I ever wanted to be was a high school history teacher, and in fact, I became that at some point after college. And I first was a teacher in Western Canada, out in the West Coast after college, and I taught there for a couple years, got a teaching certificate in a Canadian university in Vancouver. And then I moved east. I moved back to Pennsylvania and Delaware and got a teaching job. And boy, did I have a comeuppance. Teaching was far better in Canada than in the U.S., or at least in the U.S., the schools I taught in. Mm-hmm. And this was puzzling. Like, what's going on here? Whether it was salaries or respect or resources, or this issue of having voice into decision-making, having autonomy in the classroom, professional development, any characteristic, somehow as a job, it was better. And I thought, okay, and I taught in both public and private schools in this area. I was really puzzled, and I wasn't particularly happy. It was a rough job being a high school teacher. Just the discipline issues. You have a 17-year-old in your face, to be blunt. So I eventually quit. And I thought, well, I like to teach. I want to teach bigger kids who are better behaved. This is how. So I went and got a PhD and became a professor. And sure enough, I teach bigger kids who are better behaved. So that's sort of my biography, how I came to this. And in my PhD, you had to pick an area. And of course, the area I was really interested in trying to understand went back to these questions. What is it with the job in the U.S.? Well, what's it like in other types of schools? And how good or bad is it? And what's it like? And if it's worse than Canada, then how did this happen? How did schools get to be such poorly set up and managed workplaces? Just as a job, it seemed nuts to me. So I've been actually trying to answer those questions ever since.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you for that brief history. And I'm glad that you're a practitioner who's turned to an academia. Not that just folks who are just academic aren't useful, but you have on-the-ground experience in terms of what it was like in the field, right? It gives you a different perspective. And just for folks to understand sort of the dichotomy between teaching in Canada and teaching here, I did teach abroad for a year as well, in a different country that was not Canada. And yeah, the prestige was a lot different. But can you give a couple examples, just like so folks can bring to life about just what was, so you said professional development, working conditions, what was so much better about Canada's system with relation to the U.S. system for teachers?
There was two things. One was the degree of conflict. In Canada, it was pretty harmonious. Teachers, students, administrators. In the U.S., in my schools, these were worlds of conflict. There was all kinds of issues between teachers and students. I mean, half of your job was just dealing with misbehaving teenagers. There was all kinds of distrust and tension between teachers and administrators. Then there was different factions and fighting within teachers. I mean, I was sort of struck by the it was a workplace with a lot of conflict. The second thing that hit me was this issue of having autonomy and voice, being a professional who's an expert, having have input into decision making that impact your job. And teachers had no say. Our job is to implement. And of course, the history of school reform is the history of failure. And so that those two things, the conflict and sort of the voice issues, really took me back. And I kind of thought, well, I just must have, gotten unlucky and got into tough schools. And so hence, what's it like elsewhere became my passion.
Yeah, let's go into that conflict piece, right? Because we see this in private industry, you know, we see this in nonprofits, which we work with a lot of nonprofits. We see the same sort of climate issues, right? And we see that also in some schools. So what do you think is sort of the root cause, right? Not that there's one, right? But what do you think is one or two of the root causes of why there's this? Of course, there's a hierarchy, right? That is sort of naturally lends itself to distrust. But some principles have transcended that. Some schools are harmonious, right?
Yes.
And what do you think the source of it is? And what do you think the solution is to make schools writ large more harmonious?
One of the things is that elementary, secondary teaching is not a particularly well respected line of work in this country. No, teaching is not a profession in the sense that it doesn't have the characteristics of, medicine, academia, law, dentistry, architecture, accounting. It doesn't have the respect, the pay, the training, the voice, these other sorts of things. Teachers are not viewed as real experts often. And this is a societal kind of thing. And of course, when you start to study teaching in other nations, you quickly find out, gosh, there's some places, Finland, Switzerland, Korea, Singapore, etc., where it's a very highly esteemed, well-paid, well-trained occupation. So that's one issue that, you'd go to some party and someone would chat with you and they say, what do you do? And you say, I'm a high school teacher. They go, geez, why would you want to do that? Or, you seem like a smart guy. Why are you doing that? And what do you say? I would be taken aback. Let's face it. What's more important in a culture, in a society, than education and in teachers? To me, one of the big things is kind of the stature, the respect, the status of this line of work. And that's a long-standing cultural issue. And then the other thing, which I've said a couple times, I'm very interested in is the issue of voice and having say, that if you're respected, this is one of the hallmarks of the established professions. They're the experts. They have a say in their workplace, in their job, in their work. And teaching often doesn't have that. That's what I discovered. Teaching, unfortunately, is not a hugely respected line of work in this nation. And boy, of course, I discovered that when I became a professor. My gosh, it's like going from night to day. All of a sudden, you just are treated with more. I'm the same guy. Overnight, you're treated with, whether it's the real estate agent or your family or people you meet, oh, you're a professor, sort of thing. And I think that's great, but why teachers so less of that?
Yeah, and it's such a hard job. I was only an elementary school teacher. I never went to high school. I was high school principal, middle school vice principal, but I taught pre-K and fourth grade, right? Hardest job I have ever had in my life was being a classroom teacher, even though it's only 180 days. It might as well be 365 days, right? Because just put in that many hours. And so what do you think in terms of, okay, there's a societal perception of teachers as not being prestigious. And again, we're not treated as such, right? And that's historical. And there's our ways in which schools can function, right? To still value teachers. And we're going to get into the voice thing in a minute, but how could schools create sort of the microcosm in which there is value, right, in the teaching in the teaching profession within the school, within their community? Have you seen anything out there where, regardless of the broad societal, trope of teachers, are there protective strategies that either school leaders or groups of teachers put together to sort of ratify their prestige so that they feel that they are in a profession that they want to stay for a long time?
the thing that I follow a lot, and I think it can work well towards improving the lot of teachers, again, is this issue of voice. So, and this is not a new issue. We've had reforms. You can read the history way back in the 1920s. People were saying, well, listen, instead of just being treated like factory workers, these teachers should be like professionals and they should be able to have some input. It's not like they necessarily need to run the show with some input. So it's not a new issue. We've had decades, teacher empowerment and site-based management, school-based reform and teacher leadership. We've had all these different reforms. Really, at heart, they're all about giving teachers more say, more voice in the key decisions in the building that impact their work. And a lot of times those reforms haven't worked. I mean, it's hard to get schools and school districts and the whole bureaucracy to change. There is a genre of reform over the last decade and a half that I really like, and I can see that it can be successful. It's very interesting. It's where teachers lead and run a school. It's modeled after the partnerships that lawyers or accountants have, where the professionals, it's their organization. It's their firm. They make the decisions and they're accountable. And so if you take that model and apply it to elementary, secondary schools where the teachers are running it, they're still accountable, but they make key decisions in the building. In other words, it does away with the boss worker model, which is the standard in schools. And it's more of a professional model where it's this collective decision making. It's very interesting to me. I had just sort of inadvertently found out about it about a decade and a half ago, and it's mostly in the Midwest, this small but growing movement, sometimes charter schools, of these schools where the teachers have major voice. Sometimes they'll have a principal that they actually hire that does administrative stuff, but again, it's like a law firm. They might hire someone to do administrative work, but those lawyers, those partners, it's their show. They own it. So, that's a small reform. It's a growing. They have a national movement now and a website and conferences. To me, that's a very promising reform. And it's the most, there's all kinds of attempts to professionalize teaching. And of course, we're talking about that it hasn't had high status as a profession. And this is sort of, to me, I don't want to say extreme, but sort of an example of trying to really professionalizing this line of work.
Yeah, I want to sort of introduce a new paradigm for a discussion around the utility of teachers, right? Because there's a line of thinking, around the system was designed this way. It's not an accident. It's not broken, right? It was designed this way purposefully. Those who need to get educated, and those who don't, they don't. And also, we need a hierarchy within our society because we can't have everyone graduate high school, go to college, and graduate. That does not fit within our social order, right? In capitalism, it just doesn't work, right? So we need folks to be cooled out enough to accept their low-paying jobs. We need that because the majority of what makes our society work are these low-paying blue-collar jobs, right? So what is your thought around that it's designed this way and we actually need schools to perform this way?
Well, okay. Now you're talking about sort of the functions as far as students go. What are the purposes here? How much education do we want to give them? Now, of course, what you say is true historically. There's a whole argument, well, the economy's changed. There's a whole lot more knowledge work. There's all kinds of technical jobs. And the old system where, barely literate high school graduates could fill all these factory jobs, the argument is that economy is no more and it's changed. And so that there's need for a far more cognitive thinking, critical thinking, whether they're going to college or not. My son became an electrician. He deals with all these computers. It's really complicated and sophisticated, way beyond me. He went to trade school and he learned all that. It's not simple work. It's also well paid. And this is someone who was a special needs, special ed student, and now he's got this job where, a high school education would not be enough for that type of work. It's sophisticated, it's complicated, it's all this computer stuff. So The argument is that our economy has changed and the school system needs to change along with it. And we need to produce, whether you go to college, and we need to produce folks that can take these much more technical, sophisticated types of jobs. Not that there's not manual labor, there is. But, with AI, that's still going to lessen, et cetera. So those are the arguments that you need to, as far as what you're offering to the students needs to be upgraded and changed.
I agree. I agree absolutely, right? And that then, before we get into the teacher diversity question, right? Because this is the one where I really want to get into what that means, how that manifests, and is it even useful, right? Which is the foundational question. I just want to talk about the utility of the sort of your standard teacher, right? Teaching profession, the schoolhouse. And I liken it to a case study that I read way back in my doctoral program that talked about this ice making company in Wisconsin. I'm from Wisconsin. And when refrigeration came out, you had this ice making company that was very lucrative. They provided ice to all upstate Wisconsin and Illinois. And, so they were super lucrative, made a lot of money off of their ice making business, right? Because they had frozen lakes and they would, cut up the ice and ship it out. Now, when refrigeration came out, what did they do? They didn't switch their technology to then incorporate refrigeration into their model. What they did is they doubled down on making more ice, right? And sort of expanded as their ice depreciated and as the need for that ice was less and less, they decided to keep, sourcing more ice in different places, right? Until eventually they went under because they were antiquated, right? Refrigeration was going to outlast any need for frozen ice because it just simply didn't exist, right? And so to what aspect are we the ice company, where we're seeking to push out more and more traditional teachers, where society is actually changing? And I've argued that the last place a student would go, I know my son's 23 right now, if I ask him, if he wanted to learn something new, I think the last place he would say is go sit in a classroom, right? There's all these other places where he would actually go to learn something, then go to a teacher.
Well, yes, I guess there's truth to that. And in all kinds of professions, they all say, once they get on the job, they start to learn a whole lot more than they did, whether it was law school or medical school or whatever. There's truth to that. But on the other hand, to me, one of the lessons of the pandemic was that remote teaching only goes so far, particularly with the younger students. To me, I think this is maybe an under-recognized lesson, which is that you need that human being in front of those students, that they make a difference. And I know that, there's all kinds of variants of remote education. Some are much better than others, and you read about it all the time. That's not new, by the way. We've been hearing since we were kids that technology is going to remake education. I mean, when I was a kid, it was educational television, which, by the way, was so boring. And when I was sick, my mother made me watch it. Well, the technology has progressed. Okay, but still, there seems to be a need for that teacher in front of students. So back to your question, the utility. To me, that was borne out with the pandemic. The learning loss that students had because of that, because of the, shutting down schools. The second answer I'd give to your great question is, ask any person, how many teachers did you have that really impacted you? And then talk about that. Everyone, it'll be very few, which is telling. It'll be less than 5 maybe. And they'll talk about it movingly. The typical, you go with a friend, a family member, you ask them where someone really impacted them in 3rd grade, in 6th grade, in 12th grade, as a junior in college, and made a huge difference in their life. It's really interesting to hear those stories, and you're thinking, okay, that's not from a book. That's not from a job site. That's not from experience. That's from interaction with some really terrific teacher, which is so hard to do that work well. What a sophisticated set of art, craft, science skills to be a really good teacher. But boy, does it seem to make a difference. Now, that's just anecdotal. But so I see utility for teachers.
Yeah, no, I think there is a utility there still, of course, the holders of knowledge, because they they sort of they teach more than just how to spell and how to read and how to do math, right? There's a certain amount of sort of cultural norms and societal norms that teachers teach, regardless of subjects that they sort of are in charge of teaching. And the question still sort of remains, because we opened the Pandora's box. We're sort of forced to, of remote learning, right? Of going the route of, oh wow, we're not gonna have students in a traditional classroom in front of us, right? And it was wide open. It was hard, right? Because, as you say, that there's a movement for teachers to sort of own the curriculum and create their own schools that have more voice. And what I've seen over time, especially with charter schools, is that we often just replicate the same system, right? In a slightly different way.
Well, you're right. And maybe that's a return to the old stuff, which doesn't work very well. On the other hand, certainly a lot of the remote didn't work very well. I mean, I'm still puzzled. How could you get an elementary school, a middle school kid to sit down at the kitchen table and sit there in front of their laptop and stay engaged for 4 hours, 5 hours? I'm not actually sure how it worked. How you could get to how you could get remote. I found it tough enough teaching graduate students. You have some remote 2 hour or longer session. I had to force them to be engaged. I mean, because engagement is the key. To get students to learn, there has to be engagement. And I'm puzzled as to how the young kids, how remote. I'm sure there's a way of doing it which does get engagement and does work, but in many cases, it doesn't seem to work very well at all. And so you go back to the tried and true. Now, your point about charter schools, yes, charters were going to be the window of innovation, and sometimes yes, and often no. It's like, well, I think we've seen this before.
We've conflated schooling with learning, which that's not the way it has to exist, right? But we have a 3-year-old, and you said you have a son, and we see how our kids learn. I will watch my daughter and see how she functions independently within our house. Like, she'll go to this activity, she'll go to that activity. When she wants me as a teacher, she'll come and ask. But when she figures it out, she's on her own again, right? And she switches from activity to activity, and she has very little screen time. But when she does have screen time, she loves Bluey, right? She'll watch some Bluey, get some Sesame Street, right? Get a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and she'll go back to playing, right? And I'm there as a guide. I don't interact with her a lot, but she learns so much. And I think there was an opportunity if we just gave it an actual chance. I think us adults, we were so uncomfortable with remote learning that we never gave it a chance to take hold and really change the paradigm.
I think you're right, and I hope you're right in a sense. I mean, if we could use technology to revolutionize schooling so it becomes closer to learning. Look, in schools of education, forever we've been talking about holy grail as student-centered learning. There's sort of the ideal, and student-centered learning might be what your daughter's doing.
Yeah.
She's following her muse, and she's learning all kinds of things, and she's engaged, and she's motivated, and I think that's the core of student-centered learning. So if you could just take what your daughter's doing and create a school that fosters that, I think you're going to do it. I think that's going to be wonderful.
Oh, I'm leading to the prestigious Dr. Ingersoll. He's been doing this research for decades, right? He's a bastion of knowledge, right? At the Fort Knox of knowledge about how to make the teaching profession better. That's what I'm waiting for.
Yes. Well, to me, the simple answer is you improve that job, you make it more like a profession.
And through this idea of diversity, and this is something where, your more recent research is around, and I have a lot of questions around that, because if we talk about racial diversity, because that's what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about racial diversity, right? That when we think about there was a preponderance of Black teachers pre-Brown, pre-1959. There were tens of thousands of Black educators. And then post-59, with the passage of the decree to desegregate, that's when we had a large influx of white women teachers who came in. and started filling these positions previously occupied by Black teachers under the impetus that, one, if we're going to have an integrated school, most of the white parents didn't want their children having Black teachers. And then also, when they began to impart these qualification standards on a lot of these Black schools, the Black teachers didn't even have access to even be credentialed. And so they instantly lost their jobs. And so we had tens of thousands of Black educators that were erased from the classroom that left a legacy. And now there's a more contemporary thought around, well, we need to diversify. And so where are you at in your thinking about educator diversity? And one, its utility, and two, how we get there?
The utility is something I haven't studied, but there's a lot of research on that. And there's very good studies. To me, these seem common sense that having a teacher that looks like you, has maybe similar background to you, that there's a value in that. There's an argument of role models. Black kids need to see some Black male teachers in particular as role models, etc. So there's some really good arguments to diversify the teaching force, because the basic finding is that the teaching force doesn't look like America. And you're right, this started in a big way back with desegregation. And you had teachers that, Black teachers who lost their jobs. Now that was quite a while ago, but since then there is this what we call the parity gap. The percentage of students who are of color, minority students, is greater than the percentage of teachers. And so we have this gap. What I've done research on is, has it changed? Has it gotten worse? Has it gotten better? What is the gap? And what has happened to the diversification, if anything, over time of the teaching force? Because what happened is I was in this meeting, this is 15 years ago, and there was a bunch of people brought together by a foundation on this topic, diversity in the teaching force. Linda Darling-Hammond and Gloria Ladson-Billings and Jackie Irvine, and people that had really done good work in that topic. And I was invited there, and people said, listen, Richard, we have all this debate that it's good to diversify the teaching force, but no one actually has looked at what is the state of things. Has it changed over time? Has it gotten better? Has it gotten worse? Can you take on this project, Richard? We started to do this research, and just to sort of find out what's the portrait, how diversified is the teaching force, and has that changed for better or worse? So that's what we've done work on, and discovered very interesting things. Some of it good news and some of it bad news. And I can run through some of those findings if you'd like.
No, that would be wonderful, because I've done some research about student-teacher matching, right? How students are matched with teachers and the quality of teacher based on student SES and also student academic ability and student race, right? And what we found in our study on a small scale, as was found on a large scale, is that if you're low-income Black or brown students, you're more likely to have a less experienced teacher. That's just what it looks like, right?
Yes, there's no question. There's a quality. The quality of teachers, the qualification of teachers is what we call maldistributed. It varies across different types of students. And there's definitely equity issues there. Look, here's in a nutshell what we found. One, of course, there continues to be a parity gap. That is, the percentage of kids from marginalized racial ethnic groups is greater than percentage of teachers. Okay. But there's actually been a huge increase over the last 3 decades in the numbers of teachers of color. It's sort of under-recognized. No, we don't have parity, but there's been this big increase. And to some extent, it shouldn't be a surprise, because starting back in the 1980s, there's been a lot of recruitment initiatives for teachers of color. Ford Foundation put $60 million into this. 2/3 of the states have what was called minority teacher recruitment initiatives, etc. So, and they seem to have succeeded. There's been a big increase. And it's interesting, that increase has also been uneven. And this is a puzzle. So, for instance, Hispanic Latino teachers have gone up over the last 30 years by over 400%, a massive increase. White teachers have gone up less than 50%. Hispanic Latino over 400%, this huge increase. Asian teachers, over 300% increase, big increases. So no, we don't have parity, but that there's actually been some improvement here. On the other hand, the increase in Black teachers has been much, much smaller, 24% over the last 30 years. So we have this big victory, but it's very uneven. And I hate to say this, I don't know why.
Yeah, I did similar research around principal representation, right? And I think what you found as well in your article that I think I saw is that the largest increases have been in the most hard to staff schools, right? Which then contributes to the burnout rate.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So, yes, there's this big diversification and increase. But not only is it uneven across racial ethnic groups, it's also uneven across types of schools. The vast majority of the increase of teachers of color has been in large, urban, higher poverty, more diversified school districts. There's been very, very little increase in diversification of the teaching force in those suburban, more affluent school districts. This was actually part of the agenda on the reform front. Let's get more teachers of color and let's get them into these hard to staff schools that are predominantly students of color. And so in a sense that was done. And the upshot is, like you said, there's been a much, much bigger increase. I mean, the increase in diversity of the teaching force has been in those hard to staff schools. It hasn't been in the other types of schools. So, it's kind of it's uneven.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And whatever the goal is, around reaching, as you say, parity. And I want you to speculate here, right? Because you haven't done the research yet. So what would you expect to see, right? Say that we reached parity, right? Like in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, when they reached unitary status, when they're going to seek to desegregate, right? Which I've talked to some of those individuals who went to Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools during desegregation. Right. And they talk very specifically around what desegregated did for the quality of education, especially if they were a Black student. Right. When they went to the schools that were more affluent, that had more white students and more white teachers, the quality of instruction, the quality of resources, the quality of classes were markedly better. But they were just proximate to it because of desegregation. Right. So there's a marked difference in their experience. And so say that we reached educator parity, right, with the teaching force reflecting the population of students who are in our schools, what outcomes would you expect to see, possibly?
Well, the theory, of course, is that the quality of teachers make a difference. And if these students in these, hard to staff schools could get decent teachers, and also including teachers that increasingly look like them, then their educational experience would be better. Their learning would be better. Their educational levels will improve and their occupational and professional outcomes will improve. I mean, that's the logic here.
Okay. Wonderful. So what I heard is recruitment, but also with retention. They got to be paired together. Then also, in terms of focusing on teacher quality, right, in order to make sure that these, our new charge towards parity actually results in better outcomes for students, right? Because as you know, first and second year teachers, they're still learning how to teach, right? Teachers reach their best quality years between years 3 and 8.
And our research has long shown that there's a lot of quits after just 1 year, and there's a lot of quits in those first 5 years. Yes.
Yeah, and in your research and also right now, you've come back to this idea of voice. And so what I want to end with is, if folks listening want to know how to animate that, in real time, right? How does that look during a 180-day school year? And how do they mobilize that in a way that may increase retention?
Well, I mentioned earlier this reform out there of these teacher-led schools. Now, that's sort of the extreme model. The teachers, and sometimes it's through charter schools, sometimes not, sometimes it's district schools, where the teachers really have, and they vary, have a major input by definition in the decision-making in the building. And, they're held accountable. These are always, within an environment of state accountability, district accountability. So that's one way of getting from A to B.
Yeah. Can I say it? So decision making, right? There's a lot of decisions that get made, right? And so what substantive decision are you talking about? So having been a principal, right? Am I talking about the color of the walls, right? Am I talking about which classroom you have? What am I talking about here in terms of decision making? Like, what would an area for a leader to be like, all right, I want to lean in, and these are the decisions that I'm going to try to impart better teacher voice in.
Okay, I'll give some examples. So one of them is curriculum. So earlier we talked about where you have a standardized curriculum. You could call that fair, but on the other hand, kids vary, students vary. And so having some teachers be able to shape that a little bit. Now, this might not be in the principal's hand. This might be coming down from the district or the state. So it may or may not be up to the principal to be able to, okay, we're going to give these teachers more say in the curriculum. But that's one example. Another one is the issue of how to deal with student discipline behavioral issues. So the standard complaint from teachers is that they sort of become police person. And, that reached an extreme with the zero tolerance policies that, if a student does this, this happens. And again, what about the people on the ground, having some discretion as to, what are going to be the rules as to behavior, boundaries, and what are going to be the sticks and carrots? What are going to be the sanctions? This was a while back. This is a high school, students take on facts. And one day they started wearing hats to school, hats, okay? All these students had hats. Now, these days, maybe it's cell phone use or whatever it is, but there's all these fads that students have. So the principal was concerned. And she met with the vice principal and said, listen, we got this new fad. The students are all wearing hats. And, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. And this could get out of hand. And, we just need to make a standard. We make a rule that you take off your hat in school. You don't wear it to class. They called a faculty meeting. They announced it. And they said, here's what you get. The first thing is you give a warning to the student, and then you take away their hat for the day. And then the third infraction, you destroy the hat, something like that. You can imagine what happened to the faculty. The faculty totally split. There was a group that said, yeah, I'm against these hats. Let's do it. There was a group that said, listen, I don't mind the rule, but I wish we'd been consulted. We're just carrying out, we're just being police person. Then there was a group that said, listen, I teach math. I could care less if they wear hats. What's that got to do with their learning? So then the faculty has what's called mixed enforcement. If two parents have different standards with their teenager, you know where that goes. And so the whole place turns into a mess. The vice principal became utterly outraged that chunks of the faculty were not enforcing this. He would go in their classrooms and chew them out in front of the students, and it became a totally tense situation. The students quickly perceived that there was mixed enforcement, and they say, well, Mrs. Jones allows me to wear the hat in her classroom, so why are you enforcing it, Mr. Brown, or whatever? When I got into the school, a simple little thing, wearing hats, was all they talked about. It was a school, I have to say, in chaos over hats, which might seem silly, but actually it wasn't silly. It was a top-down decision. The teachers really would have liked to have had some input into it. So it's sort of workplace democracy. But in that case, the principal told me, Richard, boy, did I make a mistake. I should have never just unilaterally decided. And she said, if I could go back, I'd redo this. Student behavior might seem trivial, but it's not.
Thank you for that, right? Because we move so fast as leaders. We move so fast, so many decisions, right? And often we just willfully forget, like, oh, everyone's on board with it. Let me just announce it. But what I'm hearing you say is that things as simple as hats, in schools that most people should be on board with, if you make it a unilateral top-down decision, that could cause more harm than good.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And that was a lesson for that principal. She was really sorry.
It's hard to roll, once you ring the bell, it's hard to roll that back, right? Wonderful. Well, it's so granular. Thank you for that, Dr. Ingersoll. And I could talk to you all day because, I just love what you do. And like, you're such a bastion of knowledge, but of course I know where to find your papers at. You can go to Google Scholar and read for days and days and days. So this has been a conversation with Dr. Richard Ingersoll. He's a professor of education and sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. You could find his research any and everywhere. You're on YouTube. You have several talks up. You have other podcasts. Is there anything exciting? I mean, I'm sure there's always exciting stuff coming up. But what can we expect next from you? What are your current research agenda, books, talks?
Well, I'm working on a couple projects. One is, okay, we talked a lot about a voice, but the other side is accountability. Accountability, which because of No Child Left Behind Act kind of got a bad name.
Hmm.
And all kinds of pushback, and that legislation ended and they didn't want to reenact it. But accountability is important. I'm working on a project of how accountability and teacher voice and empowerment can work together. Do not have to be opposites. That the good school has both. That they're not actually contradictory, they're actually complementary. That's something I'm working on because the whole discussion is as if these are clashing opposites. You either give them say or you hold them accountable. You can't do both. I actually think you can and should do both.
Gotcha. Well, I can't wait for this. That's awesome. Wonderful. And so this is a new research project that's coming out. When can we expect to I I know I can get the Google notifications.
I I have a chapter coming out in a volume. It's a handbook of teachers' work. I think that's coming out in April. We actually look at the data to see, is my hypothesis correct? That accountability and employee empowerment go hand in hand, and the data says yes. So, yes.
Wonderful. So we're going to put you a link to your website in the show notes for those who are listening, because I find it very interesting, something we talk about a lot in terms of accountability. But thank you for all the stuff you shared today, as well as the piece on teacher voice, because I think that's something that, as you say, when it comes to retention, it's not so much salary, it's not so much discipline. That voice is really on the top in terms of being able to control things that affect you as a teacher. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you accepting the invitation and look forward to reading your future work.
Thanks for having me on, Tracy. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast. Remember, the fight against racism starts with each and every one of us. Together, we can create inclusive environments in our schools that celebrate diversity and empower all students. For more information, visit our website at antiracisminstitute.com and subscribe to our channel. Join us next time as we continue to shine a light on the champions of change. Stay inspired, committed, and let's make a difference together.